welcome. So great to see so many of you here and joining us. I've been looking forward to this for all week and for months, actually, as we've been thinking about this. A couple of things that I want to share as we get started. If you can have your camera on, that would be great. We're going to be doing some engagement sort of visually and some quick polls, so nothing embarrassing, and you all look fabulous. If you can't have your camera on, then no worries. That's totally fine, but you probably will want to be ready to engage in the chat. Folks have been sharing where they're coming from. I would invite you, if you want to share, I said geographically, but folks are sharing roles and institutions. If you want to share your role and your organization, we've got folks from higher ed, we've got folks from corporate learning and development, we've got folks from nonprofits, we've got folks from lots of different realms. I think it's just great context. And if you know people on the screen or you see people in the chat or people's names who you know, and you want to connect with them, just do a direct message to them so that you can do that. And, connection is a really important part of this and a really important part of learning. So that's awesome. So feel free to connect along the way. I also want to let you know at the very beginning that I'll be sharing the recording of this afternoon. So you'll be getting the recording. I'll also be sharing a PDF. It's about 14 pages. So don't worry about taking notes on every little bit of content. You're going to get all of the content. So just be present and get engaged. And I'll be sharing that with you later. And then there'll be an offer to connect with me in some various ways that we'll also get in that. And so if you've got to jump early or something like that, we'll get you the recording. We'll get you the PDF. We'll get you some other things and a follow-up email. Awesome. Great to see so many folks from so many different aspects. Mark, who I know from McAllister, Kathy, who I know from Colorado State, Ben Jackson, who's my brother-in-law, joining us here too. This is great. So wonderful to see all of you. I do want to say that we're going to have time at the end for some questions. So hold on to your questions. You can always put them in the chat. Or you might want to hold on to your question and be brave enough in role model leadership and unmute yourself as we come to the end and maybe ask your question as we come to the end. So feel free to do that. We'll make sure we have time for that. I just want to begin with a bit of an overview. So this is really about curricular approaches for L&D. And I want to really take a very expansive look at L&D. That's very specifically learning and development, but also we might think about it as employee engagement. We might think about it as leadership development. For emerging leaders or for senior leaders, I'm working with a very large global organization now on their Executive Leadership Academy, and what do they want that to be, and what do they want that to be around? You might think about it in terms of professional development. So some of you have worked with me on the curricular approach with students, and that's really great. But today we're going to focus on doing this for employees and how we do that for our employees, workers, leaders at all levels of the organization and bring that. Essentially, we want to create learning and development, leadership and development that doesn't suck, right? That's kind of the point. And too often it does. I've been in ones that are not great. I've led some that are not great. So I've been there. And this is not a criticism of learning and development professionals, because oftentimes when I talk to them, they're missing the potential of what they could be doing. They find themselves busy doing things that aren't aligned, that aren't clear, that aren't interconnected, and they see so much potential in the difference that they could make. So this isn't a criticism of those professionals, but it's a paradigm shift into what that could be. Succinctly, this is about making our learning and development for our employees and our leaders intentional, clear, aligned, and integrated. And I think those words will kind of resonate with you. It might sound a little intangible. So the more tangible things we're trying to do is create really great employee engagement and leadership development that will ultimately reduce costs and increase engagement and create this magical real estate where things get easier and more effective. It gets easier for the trainers, for the leaders, for the learning designers, for the presenters, and it gets more effective for those who are engaging. And so we're really trying to get that kind of sweet spot. And some of you who I've worked with around doing this with students and learning beyond the classroom, I think many of you have noticed and experienced that as you go along. Once you get a bit of that, you want a lot more of it. So that's where we're headed. A little bit of history and context for me. I think many of you know me. My name's Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I believe it is 2 degrees outside. So those of you coming from warmer climates, thank you for bringing your warmth and energy. And maybe some of you are also in the cold with me here in Minneapolis, Jessica, and maybe over in Fargo and other folks. Um, but I've been working in higher ed for 25 years. In the past almost 10 years, I've been working on my own. And a lot of what I do is work with higher ed organizations to bring a curricular approach to their learning beyond the classroom, to residence halls, to orientation, to conduct, to student engagement, and all of that. And I've been doing that with over 100 campuses, wrote a book on it, which is, there's a couple copies right up there, wrote the book on the curricular approach to that learning beyond the classroom. And what I want to talk about today is how we bring that to employees and leadership development and professional development. So that's a bit of the focus. So for those of you who have worked with me around creating this alignment and integration for students, now today we're going to talk about how we do this for employees and leaders at all levels. So that's kind of the shift that we're making. And great to see some folks still jumping and joining. So what I want to do now is I just want to briefly share, I think, the two hidden challenges to learning and development. And the two hidden challenges, and this comes from a lot of conversations with some of you, but I talked with about a dozen L&D professionals in lots of different roles. And the two big challenges that emerged in those conversations were the buffet table challenge and the training room challenge. And I'll start with the buffet table challenge. So just wave at everybody if you're on camera. Just wave and say, "Yep, I've heard of that." Okay, I've heard of that. So the buffet table challenge includes 5 things. One, the focus of the learning initiatives is not clear and aligned, kind of all over the place. So wave if you've seen that sort of play out. Yeah. The second part of that buffet table challenge is that many topics were developed by all sorts of different people based on what they were into, and most of them no longer work here. Raise your wave at folks if you've seen that sort of thing pop up, right? We did strengths because that person was super into strengths. And then we did experiential learning because that person was super into that. And then we did emotional intelligence. And none of those people work here, but now we're still doing strengths and emotional intelligence and those kinds of things. Um, some of the topics for learning and development were determined by a reaction to complaints and problems, often in HR issues, and our response or compliance kind of thing. This bad thing happened, and now everybody has to do these trainings and these things, right? Some of you have seen that. Another one is there's just too many good things. There's these great models and great concepts and great sessions, and it's just fabulous. And then the employees and the leaders are just bombarded with so many things, and they don't know what should guide and lead and direct them going forward. So kind of a problem of too much good stuff. Wave at us if you've seen that kind of play out. Awesome. Yeah, it's kind of strange that too much good stuff could be a big problem. And all of this creates kind of sort of an all-you-can-eat buffet where we're just putting out tons and tons and tons of stuff. And then we're saying our employees and leaders will figure out what works for them. Meanwhile, they're busy and overwhelmed and going in too many directions at work and at home and in their lives. So let's just jump here into gallery view. And let's just say this is just the buffet table problem, but just give us a 5-finger vote here on 1 through 5. One is we don't have a buffet table problem at all. I don't even know what you're talking about. And 5 is like we do all of that stuff. It's a huge issue. Just 1 through 5. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're kind of all over the place. 2s and 4s and 5s and a lot of 4s. A lot of 4s and 3s. Okay, all right. Thanks. Thanks for your voting. So the second challenge is what I call the training room challenge. And this is the second challenge. So wave at us if you've seen some of this. That learning isn't integrated into their work or the purpose of the organization. It's like a completely separate thing. People are pulled out of their work and put in a training room for 3 hours to do something completely different. And then they go back and now they're behind on their work and playing catch up and doing email on Sunday mornings and staying late, right? And when they're in the training room, pulled away from their work, they're dealing with hypothetical problems in case studies that are made up. Meanwhile, very real challenges are just sitting there untended to. Anybody see this kind of going on? Yeah, yeah. Um, this pulls people out of their work. It pulls people out of being productive and contributing. It pulls people out of their flow. We hear so many folks who are creatives who feel like meetings are an obstacle to me actually doing my work. And we're all creatives, right? We're designing, we're implementing, we do tasks and things like that, but so much of that is part of it. And not only does that hurt productivity, but people start to really resent the training room, right? They come into the training room and they're just like, ugh, what is this again? And how many of you have found yourselves in that training room and about 45 minutes in, you're like, this is actually pretty great. But for the first 45 minutes, you just resented being in the training room. And here we are again. And this is where hopes and dreams and joy come to die, right? Some of you have experienced that. So let's just see here in gallery view again. How many of you on a scale of 1 through 5, one, I don't understand, those must be terrible places to work. And five, like we do that all the time. I see that either as I enter the training room or as some of you are up front in the training room leading. So just quick 5-finger voting on how often you see that. Ready, 1, 2, 3, vote. Oh, fives and fours and threes and twos. Yeah, all over the place, all over the place. Great. Great. So these are some of the challenges that I think we have. It often goes unspoken, as particularly as we get busy and we're trying to crank out another thing by another deadline. There's been, 6 complaints to HR about this issue, so now we've got to quickly design a 90-minute thing and have everybody do it in the next 3 months. Very compliance. So a curricular approach to our employee engagement and learning and development is really designed to get around these and bring, like I said, that clarity, that intentionality, that alignment, and that integration. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of what exactly that looks like. But I want to talk about some of the more tangible things. Some of the things that we see happening is it reduces costs, right? So the number one way it reduces costs is by retaining employees for the right reasons, not because I don't want to do anything else and I'm stuck and I just want to occupy space, but I'm engaged, I'm intrigued, I'm learning and growing. And retention is really good because you don't have attrition. You don't have people leaving. And when people leave, it's a bummer and it takes 3 months to get a process started and hire them. And maybe you can, maybe you can't. And then you get a new person and you got to onboard them. And recruiting and hiring and interviewing is really expensive, not just in the dollars we spend, but the time it takes up. And we're onboarding and we're training, and it takes a while for them to get into speed. So there's just a lot of costs in people leaving, and there's a lot of money saved by retaining people for the right reasons and having them engaged. And engagement is the other big benefit, right? Increases in engagement. We see Gallup doing so many surveys about just absurd rates of disengagement on employees. And the reason engagement goes up is they start to see all of this is connected. All of this is interconnected. This training is related to the last training, is related to my job, is related to the strategic plan, is related to our core values, is related to our mission and purpose, is related to what we're doing at the all staff retreat. They see these things as interconnected and they're integrated into their work. So we stop just relying on learning and development being something that happens in the training room or in online modules, but we start to integrate it into our weekly team meetings and our all staff offsites. And we start integrating it into supervision to improve supervision and have it be connected. And performance appraisals, it becomes part of what we do rather than this thing outside of what we do. And that increases learning and growth, which is great for employee engagement. Human beings love to learn and improve and grow if they're given the right opportunity. It also increases meaning and fulfillment. They stop, doing TPS reports and they say, oh, I'm doing this report because it helps us justify the resources we need for these additional things that are really central to what we're doing. So the meaning and fulfillment increases engagement. It also increases our sense of belonging and our sense of purpose because I don't just work at this organization. I work at this organization that's really committed to these things, and we talk about it all the time, and it guides meetings and it guides what we're doing, and it's all interconnected. Another thing that it can do is when you're very clear about that, you can bring in employees who want to be a part of that, right? If you're focused on self-awareness and emotional intelligence and equity, you can say, this is what we're focused on. This is how we grow our people. And if people are into that, you're bringing people in excited about that. And if they're into other things, then they can know that at the very beginning, rather than bringing them in and then trying to convince them of the things that you're committed to after the fact. Um, it also really helps with promotion and succession. And I work with so many organizations that are really afraid of upcoming changes in senior leadership. They're really worried about senior leaders who are going to be leaving in the near future, and they're not sure who's going to replace them, and they're really nervous about that. And if we can really develop our people in alignment with our organizational purpose and mission, then we can cultivate the next generation of leaders in an interconnected way. And I think it really helps us navigate succession more openly, more transparently, and promotion becomes a big part of that. And I always think about leadership not just as people with a VP in front of their name or big titles, but for me, leadership is a process, not a position. Leadership is a process, not a position. So how do we think about those new on the ground employees as also leading the organization, just as well as the CFO? But how are we preparing all of our folks to lead in many different ways from many different places in the organization? And then that brings us to what I mentioned before, which is this magical real estate where things get easier and more effective. Easier for the L&D folks and more effective for the employees and leaders who are engaging. And one of my favorite questions is, how could you do less so you could be more? And that's not a very simple question to answer. It's what I call a powerful question. A powerful question is not one we want to find the answer to and resolve, but one we want to be with and stick with the question. But how could we do less so we could be more? So how could your VP of HR do less so that they could be more for the organization? How could your trainers and L&D folks do less so they could be more for their organization? How could less be more powerful, more effective? And those are difficult solutions to come to, but when you find them, you do start to, things get easier and more powerful and more effective. And all of this can create seamless learning where it's not this training session and this online module, but I'm learning about this thing in all these different ways. This is really great and it's interconnected. It fosters continuous improvement and a positive and resilient culture. And what happens when you have clarity about what people are going to be learning through what I'll call learning aims, when everyone in the organization knows what those things are and they're learning about them in lots of different contexts from their boss, from their supervisor, from the module, from the training session, from the award we give out every month, they start to talk about it at lunch when you're not doing your learning and development or your leadership development. They start talking about it in the hallways. They start bringing it up in the midst of a meeting. I think what we're missing here is we're not paying attention to our self-awareness. And if we could just tend to that a little bit, I think it would really clean up some of the conflict that we're having. And it really that's where things really start to sing when the learning is so clear, so integrated, and so aligned that it starts to happen in the in-between spaces. And then people are really learning with and from each other, which gets really magical. So I want to say just a little bit about sort of the components and what this could look like, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So if you have thoughts or questions, you can put them in the chat or you can unmute and we'll get some other voices in here beyond me. But the simplest version, and I'll make it super complicated if you want, but the simplest version is we want to think about this curricular approach to your leadership development or learning engagement. And you don't have to use that language. I think some people really like that language because it has gravitas and credibility and sounds really robust, and that's great. Others find it cumbersome and difficult and gets in the way. And so you might use things like, your Elevate learning and development model, right? Or something like that, whatever you might want to call it. But you can really think about it in two parts. The first part is clear learning aims. And that's where you develop a small number, maybe 3 to 5 learning goals that explicitly are what you and your organization are about. And that varies from organization to organization. You might be a large nonprofit that is really focused on learning, on emotional intelligence, and environmental sustainability. And that might be the 3 things that you organize around. Um, you might be a large company doing this around equity and inclusion, and your equity and inclusion is really focused on identity, difference, and allyship, for instance. And I'm not saying what those should be because every organization, it needs to be their own. And then you break those down into each of them kind of create their own 3 to 5 components, which I call learning outcomes. We create rubrics and narratives and all these things, but that applies across the entire organization at all levels, from new employees who are onboarded to the very senior levels and the professional development they're getting, which might be offsite retreats and directive coaching, right? And for maybe newer employees, it might be a module series or things. But everyone in the organization is essentially learning the same things in different levels of depth and breadth based on that. And so the learning aims, the goals and the outcomes and everything that comes with that are singular for the organization, right? Everybody's a part of that same thing. That's the clarity, that's the alignment and intentionality. And then the second half of this are learning pathways. Some of you who've worked with me around working with students, we call it educational plans. But I think in this context, learning pathways. And you create learning pathways for the different levels or different functions. There's lots of ways to think about this. But we might say, with our onboarding of our new employees, how do we want to get with them around these 4 things that we've identified? How might we want to do that with our managers? How might we want to do that with our emerging leaders? And how might we want to do that with our senior executive team, right? So that's kind of a level way of thinking about it. You might be a nonprofit who said, we've identified these 4 core things. And how do we want to do that with our finance arm? And how do we want to do that with our community engagement division? And how do we want to do that with our senior leaders? And how do we want to do that with our IT and HR and operations realm? And so you might create different things. You might do both of those, right? You might say, well, in our IT and our HR and our operations realm, we also have levels within that, and you might have 3 learning pathways. You might have 30 different learning pathways, but the learning pathways are the organization, the structure, the actualization, the sequencing, what should come first, and then next, and then advanced. And we can really kind of tailor that. Um, let's go back to these challenges. Let's see if I can share this here a little bit. So let's just get, if folks can just put in the chat of these impacts, what's the one that you want the most? If you could only have one of those, what's the one that you want the most? Just put the number in the chat there. Oh yeah. Wow, wow, wow. I'm shocked. I don't see any ones. You all have flush budgets. That's great. I love this for you. I love this for you. It's no surprise though, given the folks who I know who are here, that increased engagement is really important, right? And that magical real estate. All right, great, 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 great. So those are some of the impacts. I also want to share with you some of these next steps, and I want to make sure as I'm sharing um, that you can see me. So let's put me there. Hi. As we think about the next steps, so some of the things that helps you develop this, both the learning aims and the learning pathways as you go. Um, we usually begin with establishing the foundation. What is this? And that's a lot of what we're kind of talking about today. What is this curricular approach? What does it include? What does it not include? What's a part of it? How do we navigate that? And we're doing that. And then we develop the learning aims. And that's usually a process that I facilitate. and I try and generate the good thinking. I think in many of the higher ed organizations that I work with, that's a real challenge because it could be just about anything and maybe should be all sorts of different things. A lot of the nonprofits and corporates that I work with, they're very clear. We already have those. Those are already written down. We've had those from the very beginning. We've had those for 90 years. Um, and it might take some wording and some breaking down and rubrics and level of detail. Once you have your learning aims in place, then you begin to create your learning pathways. And this takes time and is structured um, and is done with the people who are a part of it. So we don't have L&D just do this for you and then happen to you, but maybe often L&D is facilitating this and engaging. And here's what we're thinking, and what are you thinking, and getting input and feedback. And there can be some really streamlined ways to do that efficiently and quickly. And then implementing assessment strategies. We have brilliant ideas in conference rooms that are terrible in reality. And we have terrible ideas that actually work out really great in reality. So what is working? What is not working? And these organizations that we're a part of and the people that are a part of them are so dynamic. They're constantly changing. We see so many different folks shifting in our current context. We see so many transitions in people as we go. And so what's working, what's not working, and how do we continue to keep doing better as we go? And then the final step is really fostering this ongoing development. This isn't a one-step thing that you work through the process and then you're done. This is a thing that you develop and improve and realize, oh, our emerging leaders program is a little bit too advanced for the emerging leaders that we have in that. We need to dial that back to better support where they're at. Or you might find that the way we're going about this with the finance team is just not really connecting and resonating with them and the work that they do. So we need to adjust that. It's working for other folks, but we need to adjust what we're doing with the finance team. We get a lot of cross learning, that continuous improvement and positive restlessness that I mentioned. So I know that's a lot of me. I so appreciate those of you who I can see who are nodding your heads along. Would love to open it up to see what questions we have. I have a few things I want to share at the end. We'll try and wrap all this up by the 50-minute mark so you have a bit of time between this and the next thing. But would love for folks who have a question, you can pop it in the chat. But even better, we'd love to unmute, hear your voice, and hear maybe what you're connecting with, what you're unclear about. I know some of you are hearing about this kind of approach for the very first time. Some of you have been working with it a little bit more. Some of you have been working with students, but love to hear from you what you're connecting with, what you're resonating with, what you're curious about as we go forward.
I'll jump in first.
Yeah, hi,
One of
Mark.
the things, how's it going? One of the
Good,
things you
good to see
said
you.
early on, good to see you too. Sorry. One of the things you said early on was the challenge that I think a lot of us have faced is in training programs and in learning and development. You have people coming in that are dealing with hypothetical scenarios in the training room, but they've got phone calls and they've got emails coming in, and they're constantly distracted, and their mind's not in it, and they don't want to be there. What recommendations do you have or best practices do you think are the best ways to get people more engaged without having to wait that, hour before they finally, oh, really, this is actually not bad, to actually
Yeah.
get them engaged and to keep them there
Yeah.
mentally and physically?
Yeah, I think the shift that really changes is, let's say we want people to learn about emotional intelligence. And when we think, how do we want to teach our employees about emotional intelligence? I'm going to create PowerPoint slides. I'm going to put people in a training room. I'm going to schedule it. That's how I would teach it. And I think that mindset of, okay, we want our employees to get this. How do we teach it? Sort of fosters that. If we shift instead to, okay, emotional intelligence is what we're aiming for here. What's the best way for our employees and our leaders to learn that? And that's a subtle shift, but it really gets us thinking about where are they already wrestling with this? And so it might be a series of 3.5 minute videos that get sent out on Monday at 1 o'clock. And we invite them to think about that and integrate that in. And the great thing about videos is they can watch it and they can watch it again and they can integrate it in. And because everybody's getting it, they start talking about it, they start bringing it in. We can offer supervisors and managers, here are 4 great prompts to ask the people you're leading in your next one-on-one meeting about self-awareness or self-management or relationship awareness or relationship management around leadership. So I think, there's nothing wrong with the training room. We can still do training room sessions. We can still do the online modules, right? Those aren't bad, but they're not the only tricks we have. So how do we think more broadly about team meetings, offsites, supervision, rewards, performance appraisals, um, team huddles, the communications we send out, right? Some folks send out quarterly magazines, some folks send out quarterly things. How do we have these things come up again and again and again? And then also, how do we assess where that learning is happening and not happening? Because we might hope it happens in supervision meetings and then find out they don't ever bring it up. Okay, well, now we need to work with that. Do we need to hold people accountable and execute better? Or is that just a bad idea and unrealistic? And we need to say, well, it's not going to happen in supervision meetings. We need to do it in these ways. Maybe bring it into team meetings or another thing. I think also when we are doing the training room, rather than my case study, like I'm just a guy. I don't work where you work, Mark. Why would I bring a case study? Let's bring real case studies. Have you bring your own. One of the programs I work with is Evolve, which is around leading around, particularly around equity and belonging. And one of the things we do is we have the participants at the conclusion of that, rather than work through case studies that we've made up, we have them bring their case studies. I'm really challenged around my president who keeps doing this, and the group kind of works on that. And so the group is working on that very real challenge. So those are some of the ways I think we can uh, bring the learning to what they're actually wrestling with, rather than pulling them out of that, making things up, hypotheticals, and then sending them back. And oftentimes when people go back for the person leading that training, we're like, oh, this is going to be so helpful. And the person taking the training is like, I don't get how this relates to my real life at all. Um, but I think we can be by being explicit, we can make more of those connections.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Who else would like to get in here? Yeah, I see Amy there asks not really a question, but appreciation for how could you do less so you could be more. And you can think about that for your organization, for your team, for yourself. And this really comes from more on that. The book Essentialism by Greg McKeown is a really great read. It's super easy to read. He's also on tons of podcasts, but that's sort of the most powerful question way I can think about that. What are our priorities? What's most important? And how do we really invest more in the things we're doing that are the most important and invest less or stop doing the things that aren't really moving the needle? And that can often be quite challenging to do, but quite powerful when you do start doing it. What other questions are coming up for folks, or some of you maybe have things to share or examples, or would like to know a little bit more?
Hi, Keith.
Hi, Ben.
How's it going?
Good. I haven't seen you since last night at a basketball game. So,
Yeah, his
Ben, you
daughter
do you do
really,
learning and development all the time, day
yeah,
in, day out. And so
yeah.
I'm
So
super
my
interested
name
in
is
what you're
Ben.
curious about.
Yeah, my name is Ben. I work with Transamerica in their learning development. I focus primarily on asynchronous learning. So, and then kind of directed over our operations area at Transamerica. So, a little background. I really am curious, the next steps and how asynchronous learning will fit into that. In the two big problems we have buffet table, the buffet table challenge in online learning is that's the challenge in my
Yeah.
mind. And then you also consider that training room challenge where there's no way to actually track or identify um, resentfulness or that I'm not committed to this, right? So
Yeah.
you're kind of trusting the learner to come in automatically and say, this is gonna be good. I will take away something from this.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm curious about in the next steps, where does asynchronous learning kind of fall, and how the big question is, how do you get intentional, clear, aligned, and integrated outcomes in an asynchronous format when that is kind of my personal like approach? I spend very little time face to face with people.
Right. But a lot of time designing and doing the asynchronous thing. I think that one of the challenges with asynchronous is we can just create a bunch of stuff, right? You can just you can turn 5 into 12, you can turn 12 into 37, you can turn 37 into 252 things. And then when anybody says, well, are you training folks on emotional intelligence? You're like, yep, we've got a module for that. Check box, nobody takes it, or people who take it, hit play, go have lunch, come back, do the quiz at the end, that kind of thing. So I think asynchronous learning can be a really incredible part of an overall learning and development strategy. I think it's a great way to communicate information and content. It's not a great way to engage and interact and apply. I think it's a great way to convey information and content because I can rewatch it. I can go back if it's 6 weeks later and I took that thing and I thought, well, that'll never apply to me. And then 6 weeks later, I'm really in a conflict where it's be super relevant. I can go back and I can do that. And so I think there's lots of ways that can be really relevant. But if that's our only trick, then we get into a lot of real challenges. And so, how do we make that one part of our learning and development? And so, we have these asynchronous things and the supervision and the meetings and the rewards and our annual offsite and all of these things. And organizations that really do that well, what they find is they have a lot fewer asynchronous content, but it's way better and it's better aligned. I think another way that you can do this, particularly in your context, would be instead of having 135 asynchronous modules, what if we had 4 different pathways that were sequenced and aligned? And these are all the modules that we have around equity and inclusion. And we recommend you take one of these 4 first and then one of these 4 next. You can pick any one of the 4, but they're sort of designed to sort of build you toward this. And these are the ones that we only have available for our employees who are in year 0 through 5. These are the ones that we have for our emerging leaders who manage and supervise others. These are the ones we have for our executive leaders. You can figure this out. But how do we create pathways? So it's not just this all you can eat buffet with so much stuff, but it's like, no, do this first and then this. And if you're at this level, then you go here. And some folks even can create certification programs. Like once you've done 2 from A, 3 from B, 2 from C, and 4 from D, then you get a certification in equity and inclusion. Or when you've done these, and you can kind of create these so that the learner has choice, but also there's continuity of the experience and the messages. So if you take module 1 and 2 from group A, and I take module 3 and 4, we're having different experiences, but the fundamentals of what we're learning are the same. So then if you and I are in a meeting, we're using the same language. I think shared language is a huge part of this because if you're talking about self-awareness and I'm talking about self-efficacy, and Lakin is talking about identity, we might say, we're all talking about the same thing, but how many of our employees are going to see that interconnection? Very few. But if we all agree, we're all going to talk about self-awareness. That's the language we're going to use in every one of these modules and all of these different things, and we're going to refer back to it. That can really start to sing. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I see Kathy there in the chat, how asynchronous learning aligns with coaching and performance reviews by leaders. Yeah, I think this can be a really great way to make sure that your coaches know what the content is, right? I think we use coaching in a lot of different ways. So I think about coaching as not content, but about process. And some people use coaching in slightly different ways. So how do we make sure the coaches know what content you're learning? So if I were working with your organization, Kathy, I would want to know what are the 4 goals that you have? What's the language that you use for that? It would really help me coach in alignment with that rather than the language I use. Like you might be using equity in your organization. So I don't want to talk about um, social justice, right? Because that's not the language that you're using, or you might be using the language of community repair, and I don't want to be talking about restorative practices, right? Because it's very similar, but how do I get so I might coach around similar things, but align that language. And I think performance reviews can be really similar. I think most people, when they come time to get their performance review, uh, probably schedule time with their therapist or a loved one or someone who they trust because they're dreading it. And what I'll tell you is that most leaders who are offering performance appraisals also do the same thing because they're dreading it too. And it doesn't have to be that way. How could we have performance appraisals that are not a surprise, that are aligned, that are integrated? This seems to be an issue that I'm seeing repeatedly. We've talked about it for this past 6 months. I'm just not seeing movement on it. I'd love to get you connected with this coach that we have who really helps people through that. We really want to invest in you rather than just this deficit model, punitive thing ick, but really invest in that. And so those are some of the ways, Kathy, I'm seeing how asynchronous learning can be a great way to get your coaches on board, to get your managers and supervisors on board, and also integrate that into performance reviews. And if we're really investing in our people and they believe that, they're much more open to learning rather than just this compliance thing I got to do because it's a requirement. And if I don't, I'll be scolded, right? It can really shift. We got maybe time for one more question. I want to offer a couple more things before we wrap up, and I do want to kind of give you some time at the end to move in between things. But anyone else want to unmute and jump in here with a question, or maybe drop one in the chat? But I'd love an unmute.
Um, Hi all. Dave Summy, I work at Willamette University in our Atkinson Graduate School of Management. And thinking about a previous role, I know that at least in higher ed and in certain areas, like in housing, there's a lot of entry-level roles, like it's really entry-level, bottom-heavy, and then there's a lot of turnover in those roles.
Oh.
And so really thinking about like those pathways for both progression, but also what do you want people to learn in those, say, first 6 months, year, 2 years? There was a model at Gonzaga University that a colleague developed years ago. I don't know if they still use it, but the idea was that the first year you were running behind everyone. And some of this is the cyclical nature of higher ed.
Yeah.
And then the second year running alongside, and really in the third year was when you could push ahead and be a leader in your role or in the department. And I really liked that model and used that when I was leading teams, just to talk about it, but never thought about attaching really more specific or concrete learning aims and learning outcomes to it. But just that scaffolded learning can be really powerful to help people understand, like, you're in a new role. I don't expect you to know all the things. You're going to be behind. That's okay to feel that way. But lean on the people who are that third, fourth year person, and then that empowers those people even in the same role to also develop those leadership skills with peers.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And I'm guessing you're thinking about a role that was sort of designed to be about 3 years, right? Maybe four, but kind of designed to be that way. And maybe some folks have similar roles. And I think that's a great way. I thought about my first job out of grad school in a very similar way, right? Like I'm going to be confused and learn a lot. Then I'm going to be competent and successful. And then in my third year, I'm going to lead. That's kind of how I thought it. It sounds very similar to what you're talking about. We could be explicit about that. We could name it very clearly and give people permission and not have to try and prove themselves in their first week, which is actually can do harm, but also stage this and progress and also not take on leadership roles before they're really ready, right? This is not the right, that's a great opportunity. I would love to do that next year. This year is not the right time for me because I'm focused on these other things. In larger organizations, we might think about that in terms of you're talking about year one, year two, year three. What if we thought about year 0 through 5, 5 through 10, 10 through 15? Right? Or we might think about it in levels. I think a lot of times we have folks who are in the organization, folks who manage or supervise or have direct reports, and then senior leaders who are over multiple folks. That could be another version of what you're saying about one, first this, and then when you're here, you do this, and then when you're here, you do this. And we don't have to stick with three. We might have four, we might have five, we might have seven. But I think being explicit about that, one of the things I'm constantly reminding particular senior leaders, and I think the more senior you get, the more important this is, we have to be explicit and repetitive. And most senior leaders have some things that they really want to stick with their teams, but they're not being explicit and they're not being repetitive. And they're sick of hearing themselves say that. But most people weren't in the meeting every time I said that. Patty might have been there in two of the meetings that I said it, but for the first one, she wasn't paying attention because she was worried about this text message from a loved one and tending to other things, or distracted, or just got an email about a crisis, or who knows what, right? This is very human. This is very real. So how do the things that really matter? Um, Nothing a leader says makes any difference. It's what the leader says over and over again that moves the needle, right? It's so what our VP is always talking about, that moves the needle, right? What the CEO is always saying, every story he tells is really about this. That's the kind of thing that moves the needle. So what do we want to be explicit about? And then how do we be explicit and not just everybody knows, right? Or make these assumptions or have this secret decoder ring that if you're in the know, or have this supervisor, you get that. But how do we systematize that so everybody gets that? It's not dependent on if you have Brooks as a supervisor, you get this great experience. You have Keith, you get a less than desirable experience. How do we share? If Brooks is doing a great job supervising, let's make sure that everybody kind of learns from that. And collaboratively designed can be really great. Okay, so I want to move to a few things. As you can tell, I love this stuff. I could do 3 hours. I could talk about it all day. Some days I do talk about it all day. I'd love to talk about it with you, whether you're in higher ed or in learning and development or thinking about your own executive leadership development academy. I know we have folks who are joining this for all sorts of different reasons. I'm wondering if you're thinking about this as, is this something we want to do? I'd call that considering. You might be thinking, we definitely want to do this. How do we launch it? And that's a process. Or you might be thinking, how do we want to evolve this process that we already have in place? And I work with folks at the considering, the launching, and the evolving. We do that work in lots of different ways. I'd love to talk with you about it. I'm holding all day on Wednesday, February 26th to have conversations about this. And so I'm just going to pop a Calendly link. And if you can find time, if you want to chat, I'm just holding that day. And you can use that link to find a time on Wednesday, February 26th. If you can't do the 26th, you can find another time, but that's just sort of the day I'm designating for this. And booked with things this week, and then next week I have a conference and a couple of leadership retreats that I'm leading, and so we'd be looking at a couple weeks out. But if you'd like to have a conversation about considering this, about launching this, or maybe some of you want to evolve it, I'd be happy to connect with you there and do that. Like I said, I'll get you a follow-up email with the recording and with links and all of that. And for those of you who want to stay connected, the best way to do that is through this link, which is just, will take you to my newsletter every Tuesday morning. I share what I'm thinking about leadership, learning, and equity. I think many of you found out about this from that newsletter. If you're not connected with me in that way, that's a really great way to do that and stay connected. Awesome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being a part of this. I'm going to keep this open. I'll stop the recording here in a moment, but I'll keep this open in case anybody wants to connect or follow up or ask a question sort of off the recording. But thanks so much for being here. Would love to connect with you. In the meantime, stay warm, enjoy your afternoon, and we'll talk to all of you soon. Thanks, everybody.